and welcome back to Food to Go, the podcast brought to you by the New Food team in association with Merck. My name is Grace Galla and I am the assistant editor of New Food, and I will be your host for today. In today's episode of Food to Go, I sit down with Emily Miles, Chief Executive of the Food Standards Agency. She talks to me about the work the FSA has been doing to keep our food system as safe as it can be, and updates me on her recent trip to Brussels, sharing the insight she has gleaned from speaking to other regulatory bodies around the world. So without further ado, let's get straight into the podcast. For today's episode of Food to Go, I'm really excited to be joined by Emily Miles, Chief Executive of the Food Standards Agency. Emily, thank you so much for joining me today on Food to Go.
Total pleasure to be with you. Thanks, Grace.
It's so great to have you speaking on our podcast, and thank you for making the time in your schedule. I know you've had a really busy few weeks as you've just been on a really exciting trip to Brussels. But before we find out a little bit more about that, I'd love to open up this conversation by asking, who are you and what exactly is your role at the Food Standards Agency?
So I'm the Chief Executive of the Food Standards Agency. I've been doing that for about 4.5 years. So I joined in 2019. I'm a civil servant by background. I've been in the civil service for about 23, nearly 24 years. I did a bit in the Home Office. I was Director of Policing. I've worked in Downing Street. And then in 2015, I moved over to DEFRA. And in 2016, of course, the referendum happened and I worked a lot on Brexit, and then moved over to the Food Standards Agency in 2019.
Emily, you've got a really impressive work history and you sound completely qualified to be in the role that you're in. So tell me a little bit more about the part of your role as being Chief Executive. I know that you have the chance to visit some industry members all across the UK, keeping your finger on the pulse of the sector. Can you tell our listeners about a few recent visits and why trips like these are so important as part of your role?
It is really important to get out and see things on the ground, because in the end, it's not the Food Standards Agency that makes food, it's businesses that make food that's safe and authentic for consumers. And we try and create guidance and so on to make that as easy as possible. And so I think it's really important that I get out and see how it's operating. I mean, I've done loads recently, just in the last year or so. I had a fantastic visit to a sandwich maker in Essex where I saw how they did their listeria management. Loved going to the Greggs Centre of Excellence for Donuts in Newcastle, where they were doing really interesting stuff on allergen management. I had a great day with Mark Williams, who at the time was the Chief Executive of the British Egg Industry Council last autumn, and he took me to Noble Foods and we talked a lot about the Lion Standard and how to keep salmonella at bay. I've just been to Forza Foods, who are Asda's cooked meats facility. Been to Moy Park in Northern Ireland for the to see the poultry abattoir, and then I've gone to a couple of smaller abattoirs recently as well. So one in North Wales, which was beef and sheep, and then one in Birmingham where I saw non-stun slaughter for the first time. So yeah, I try and get out and about. As you know, the Food Standards Agency does a lot around, particularly in the meat hygiene space. So it feels quite important to see how that all operates on the ground.
Emily, your job role sounds absolutely fascinating, and you being out and about makes it seem like you've got a really holistic view of the food landscape in the UK. I know I mentioned earlier that you just got back from a trip to Brussels and you went over there to discuss international cooperation when it comes to food safety. Before you went, what were some of the main concerns on your mind that you wanted to flag when you were out there?
So I guess there were probably three main objectives that I had from the visit. The first was around FSA EU collaboration. Since Brexit, and then because of the negotiations that happened over the Windsor framework, there's been much more formal engagement with the European Commission and less informal. And I was just keen to sort of restart connections there. I think we're making progress a little bit. The second thing was that we're doing some really interesting work in the UK on reforming our regulated products service, which is a service we inherited from the EU. It used to be run by the EU, and now we run it in the UK. So I wanted to go and introduce some of that to stakeholders there and to the EU. And then the last thing on my mind is more of a domestic issue, which I think is in common in some other countries too, which is just about vets, making sure that we have enough vets to cover our official controls work. So I wanted to have a conversation about that.
Well, I'm looking forward to speaking about these three key points in the episode ahead, but you just mentioned regulated products, and I wanted to pick up on the regulated products reform. Given the upcoming reforms to the regulated product system, what specific changes are being proposed to improve the process? And how would you say these changes aim to address the pace of innovation in the food industry?
Yeah, so just to say, for those who don't know about regulated products, there are 12 regimes that we inherited from the EU. So animal feed additives, food additives, genetically modified food, novel foods, that's just a section of them. Each one is where a business has to apply to us and make sure that we have done a risk assessment of their dossier before they can place their food or animal feed on the market. And we inherited this system from the EU, and it grew the FSA so that we could do this work. So we've got a lot more scientists, a lot more policy advisors now than we did working on this. But we are getting more applications than we expected. At the moment, we've got over 450 in the service, and we've only concluded about 70 or so far, and we're expecting our caseload to grow because we're not quite keeping up with the amount coming in. So we're just concerned that we're not offering a very timely service to applicants. I mean, it's not a very swift service anyway. Even at the EU, it tends to take several years for these applications to be considered, but we think we can do better than that. So we're doing reforms in a couple of phases. The ones that we've just started consulting on are that we want are related to particularly on renewals. So for three of their regimes, smoke flavourings, animal feed additives, and GM, once you apply and you get authorised, you then have to reapply 10 years later to get reauthorised. And we think that that's not proportionate. We think once the risk assessment's been done, if there hasn't been additional information of safety risk that's come to light, we don't think that's needed again. So we're proposing that we remove the requirement for renewals and instead rely on calling in particular substances if we think there's an issue. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing we're doing is that just one of the kind of oddnesses of the way we brought the law into UK law, we, unlike when it was in the EU system, where when something's authorised, it just gets put on a register. Here, when something's authorised, it has to be authorised by the minister. Actually, we then have to go through a process of laying a statutory instrument in front of the Scottish, Welsh assemblies and the Westminster Parliament, and waiting for a number of days for that to come into force. So it basically adds 3 to 6 months to the process. We have to get lawyers to prepare the statutory instrument. Then we have to go to ministers in 3 nations, and then we have to make sure we align with parliamentary and assembly dates to lay the instrument. And we think we could just do that a lot more simply, and we could save quite a lot of resource. So we're suggesting removing the statutory instrument requirement and just doing it like we used to in the EU, which is having a pretty straightforward register. So those are our initial reforms. And then at the FSA board that's coming up in June in Llandudno, we're having, and the boards are always held in the open, we're having a big discussion about future reforms that we'd be interested in. Bit of a kind of green paper style conversation where we're thinking a bit more deeply about how we organise ourselves. Do we really need to have all these different regimes? We're about to add a 13th, which is gene-edited food and feed. Perhaps we could have a single front end and then bespoke pathways for particular issues. Perhaps we could use our very expert science resource in a more tailored way to certain things. And maybe we could rely more on international other regulators and their work in our work. So we're just thinking quite deeply about it. And our objectives are to have the same standards of food safety and consumer protection. That's why we're there. We're here to make sure that food is safe and is what it says it is. And we want to put consumers absolutely at the heart of that, but also to make sure that we're using taxpayer-funded resource in the best way possible, in the most proportionate way, and that those who are innovating in the food industry get a swifter service and are able to get their products to consumers more swiftly if possible. So it's quite exciting what we're up to.
That's really interesting. You've mentioned a number of reforms there to the UK's regulated products framework. How can you assure stakeholders and consumers that food safety standards will not be compromised?
So we just, it's like this is what we're here for, is food safety. So that's front and centre of the FSA's mind, and also our colleagues in Food Standards Scotland. It's our top priority, and we're built for that. So we have over 100 scientists that work for the Food Standards Agency who are microbiologists, toxicologists, experts in contaminants, experts in radiation. And they're just an amazing, amazing bunch of people. And we also rely on scientific advisory committees where academics come together and give us independent advice as well. So these products, when we're assessing them, will often go through that independent scientific advisory committee as well as to our own scientists. So that process is actually highly rigorous, and that won't go away. What we're just thinking through is the extent to which we need to apply that deep process to every single sort of application, where there are products that actually are analogous to others, or where we can be a bit more confident in the safety first off, then we may be able to do a bit less deep assessment. We're just trying to think that through. But basically, the whole point of the Food Standards Agency is to protect the consumer interest. And we were set up after the BSE crisis, which happened in the 1990s. We were established in the year 2000. And it was because there was a sense that in the 1990s, government hadn't been on the side of the consumer, it had been on the side of industry, and it hadn't levelled with consumers about the risk. So we sort of carry that responsibility very, very heavily at the Food Standards Agency. We feel that we're there to make sure that consumers get protected.
That's great, Emily. I want to pick your brains about something else now, and it's a concern that's been on many food industry minds, and it's about the lack of vets in the UK. So following your recent Brussels visit, is there any insight you can offer to put those concerns at ease? I know we had a conversation on a previous episode of Food to Go with Nick Allen, who's the CEO of the BMPA, and he flagged his own concerns. So is there anything you can say to, put minds at ease?
I am actually quite worried about vets and whether we've got enough to do the work that's required. So I don't think I can completely put you at ease. But if you think about what's happened in the last 3 or 4 years, so with Brexit, there's been an increase of demand on vets because of all the export health certificates that now need to be signed off for exporting products of animal origin to the EU. There's also been a pet boom because of the pandemic. So there's more demand on vets in the UK than there was. And then if you look at the registrations of vets with the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons over the last few years, they've fallen. And they're finding from their research that vets are often leaving the profession just within a few years of having trained. So I think the domestic vet situation is quite challenging. That we actually at the FSA, we rely enormously on vets. I mean, they just are so important to animal welfare and food safety in abattoirs, and we have an official vet in every one of the 270 abattoirs in the UK. They also go and inspect cutting plants, and we have vets that do audits of abattoirs too. And we work very closely with a service delivery partner, and they rely almost entirely on foreign vets to come and do that work. They struggle to attract UK trained vets into the work. So actually 99% of their vets, and it sounds like a high number, but literally I think they have around 270 vets, and they've just gone up to 4, but it was until a couple of weeks ago 3 are UK trained, and the rest are from overseas. And if you look at the registrations from graduates of EU vet schools with the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons over the last few years, it's fallen enormously. So in 2018, they had, I think, 1,195 registered from EU vet schools. It was 365 in 2021. It's recovered a little in 2023, up to 565, but we're nowhere near back to where we were in 2018. So there are insufficient vets to do the work is the issue. There are a few coming in from abroad. There aren't enough being trained and then staying in the profession in the UK. And I think there's quite a deep systemic issue going on that needs addressing.
Emily, why do you think there is that lack of UK trained vets? And do you think there is anything that can be done to support applications to be officially trained?
I think there's a number of things. I was just in front of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee on this very question. They did a one-day, they called it a non-inquiry because they didn't produce a report, but they did a one-day inquiry into it. And I was there with a number of people from different organisations like the BBA and so on. And I think there's a number of things that can be done to make a difference on this. One is, just the volume of student placements. There's and funding for people to go and study veterinary science. There's something about the Veterinary Surgeons Act, which was done in 1966. Like, it's quite an old bit of legislation, which doesn't really allow for the vet-led team approach, where the vet is supervising other professionals like veterinary nurses and so on. So you could divide up the work in a slightly different way, as a lot of professions have done in the last 10, 20 years. Police officers now have police community support officers who do some of the work. Same thing that you have with nurses and auxiliary nurses. Like, you could do the same thing in the vet space, but we need some legislation to change that. And then there's also, and particularly into public health veterinary work, I think that we just have a slightly different setup in the UK, where there's not a huge amount of training on the public health side that's done in the course of the standard 5-year degree. There's a little bit, but if you go to Spain, for instance, it's like a 3-month module is all the public health work. So they're doing a lot more experience in abattoirs, a lot more experience on epidemiology and so on. So I think the undergraduate degree is quite packed. It's got lots of requirements in there already. And then I think there are requirements after vets in the UK graduate, where they're wanting to get the RCVS accreditation within a couple of years of graduating, which most of the requirements are to do with working in practice rather than working in an abattoir. So I think there's some sort of structural things to attend to there. What we're doing at the FSA and with our service delivery partner is looking at how to make the roles in abattoirs more attractive. Can we offer part-time working? Can we combine the roles with other public health work? We've started running some extramural studies opportunities for undergraduates. So we just had 8 women undergraduates come to the FSA a few months ago and just spend a week with us finding out about public health veterinary work, and they got quite animated and excited about it. So we're trying to sort of open up and say, right, this is, you may not know much about this, but this is quite an interesting thing to do with your career. So I feel like we're turning the corner on it, and it's good that we're starting to see some UK trained vets working for our service delivery partner, but there's a lot more to go.
This sounds really promising, Emily, and hopefully that should put a few industry minds at ease. You mentioned earlier about utilising the skills of veterinary professionals from abroad. How do the recent changes to immigration rules and the increased salary requirements for skilled workers affect the recruitment and retention of vets and indeed vet hygiene inspectors in the UK meat industry?
Yeah, so we've just had a change in policy from the Home Office where they've raised the minimum salary for getting a skilled worker visa, and it varies by profession what the minimum salary would be. But in effect, for a meat hygiene inspector, it would mean you'd have to be paid over £38,000 a year in order to get a skilled worker visa. And at the moment, MHIs, so meat hygiene inspectors, tend to be paid around £28,000 a year. And then for vets, in order to get a skilled worker visa, you would need to be earning around about £51,000 a year. And at the moment, an official vet who's working a 40-hour week would be earning about £39,000 a year in the work that we do in the public health space. So it's quite a big and quite a sudden change. And the consequences are quite significant. We're just trying to work them through. We will be going to the Migration Advisory Committee and just asking them to reconsider whether this is genuinely what was intended by the Home Office, because it's such a big leap up. A 13% increase overnight in vet salary is a bit unexpected. I think the policy intent, which is to have more domestically trained professionals and less foreign professionals, I understand from the Home Office. I can understand why they're wanting to do that, but I think that we need, if you think it takes 5 to 7 years to train as a vet, and there's some structural issues about the way that the Veterinary Surgeons Act is organised and the sort of exams that the RCVS set and so on, there's quite a lot to do to try and get the domestic market a bit better. So I think a longer transition would be better. And what we'll do at the moment, we're just trying to think through what the implications are and how on earth we handle this situation to make sure that we can provide a good service to to abattoirs as we have managed. And, we've done well with our service. We had a tough time through the pandemic and with Brexit, where we thought we might not have enough vets, and we did manage to provide a service to all abattoirs the whole way through. So I'd really like that to continue if possible.
Given that many vets and meat hygiene inspectors in UK meat plants are recruited from abroad, as mentioned earlier, can you share what strategies are currently being considered to mitigate the potential additional costs associated with these higher salary requirements for these vital roles?
Yeah, we're talking to the Home Office to see if those requirements do need to stay in place, and we're putting evidence to the Migration Advisory Committee as well. And then we're just, if that doesn't happen, then we're having to think through whether recruitment at higher salaries will be needed. If it does, then we're going to have to find funding for that, which I'm not funded for this year. So yeah, we're just trying to think all of that through at the moment.
Thank you for that insight, Emily. If there's one thing that plays a key role in ensuring food safety in food and beverage production plants, it's hygiene monitoring. Our podcast sponsor, Merck, understands this and emphasises that attention to hygiene during the manufacturing process of food and beverage products is paramount due to the ever-present risk of dangerous microorganisms that can cause foodborne illness by infection or intoxication. As a way to minimise the contamination risk of products and personnel, Merck offers reliable and efficient solutions that have been designed in a way that routinely verifies the effectiveness of cleaning and disinfection practices for equipment, personnel, and high-touch surfaces, ensuring the highest standards of cleanliness and safety in your facilities. With increasing demands for food and beverage safety, Merck offers leading technical tips and training for in-process control testing. Their expertise can help you maintain top standards of safety and quality while still boosting production efficiency. To find out more about how you can partner with Merck to support your hygiene monitoring standards and optimize your food safety protocols, you can visit www.sigmaaldrich.com/HACCP. Back to the podcast. I want to change topics slightly now and discuss challenges when it comes to local authority resourcing. I've been having a look, and in your 2022 Our Food report, a 14% decline in food hygiene posts across local authorities over the past decade were highlighted. How does the FSA plan to address this resource challenge and ensure that food safety inspections remain at an acceptable level?
So it is really worrying what's happening in local authorities. And I just want to pay tribute to the food teams around the country who do just such impressive work. So one of the other things I quite often do with visits is go and see local food teams. And I was just recently in Leeds visiting the food hygiene inspection team there. So there are environmental health officers and trading standards officers around the country doing some really important work with the vast majority of food businesses. That's the front line really for food hygiene and food standards regulation. And as you said, and we've been calling out in our annual report on food standards, the number of inspectors has been reducing over time. And I think that is concurrent with the amount of resource going into local authorities overall. And what we're starting to see is basically they're having to just ruthlessly prioritise their efforts. They're managing to keep up with they call them interventions, but inspections and sampling and so on, with the highest risk premises, but with the really low risk premises, places like pharmacies where they sell sweets and so on, they're just not getting to them and as frequently as they did. So we're just quite worried about it. There's a number of things we're doing. Obviously, we're not just sitting back and watching that situation. We're not in a situation, local authorities are independent, competent authorities. They get their funding in a grant from central government. We don't provide funding to them. It's not a service that works that way. So we have limited ways of intervening, but there are some things that we do, some levers that we do hold. So, for example, we set out in our food law code of practice what the qualifications are that local authority officers need to do certain interventions. We've been reviewing all of that and thinking about the competencies that we think are necessary and trying to make that as flexible as possible. We've also just started working on a methodology for local authorities to use, and then we're working really closely with the Chartered Institutes of Environmental Health and Trading Standards to promote those professions. We've just worked up an apprenticeship scheme with the Chartered Trading Standards Institute to try and attract more people into the profession, because I think there is also an issue about it being known about and being attractive. And then we're also doing some sort of deeper reform thinking about how we how the FSA can help local authorities apply their limited resources to the most risky places. We've just piloted, and then we're rolling out at the moment, a whole new approach to food standards work, which is when you're going and checking ingredients labelling and making sure that food is what it says it is. And that is where we basically have a central FSA function that's convening and getting all the intelligence in from different local authorities and then helping them target their resource at particular issues of concern. And we're finding that that's resulting in more effective inspections. And there's particular work, for example, like grey market goods from the US, where they're not, they're goods that shouldn't be on sale in the UK because they perhaps have food additives in that aren't authorised here. They've been sort of going under the radar, but by getting intelligence together, we've been able to do a more targeted approach to trading standards officers and have them go out and inspect those. So we're doing some things like that.
Slightly earlier on, you mentioned attracting talent, and I wanted to pick up on that. There are currently over 13% of local authority food hygiene posts vacant. So can you shed a bit more light on what strategies the FSA is considering to attract and retain talent in these crucial roles?
Yeah, I mean, I think I said a bit about that earlier, but it is true. And it's also, it's an ageing profession. So one of my colleagues was recently visiting Wakefield, and the average age in the food team there is 51. And often when I do meet environmental health officers and training standards officers, they've often been doing that job for sort of 20 years or so. So it is sometimes longer. So it is one where we do need to try and attract new people in. So I said we're reviewing our suitable qualifications to see if we can develop more flexible or modular approaches to delivery. So, for example, supporting officers to deliver the lower risk inspections, the kind of easier official controls, before needing to be fully qualified or chartered. So that's one of the things we're doing. We're talking to local authorities about how we can use our quite limited training budgets to support them in terms of their kind of officer competency and boosting their supply of officers. We're also, as I said, doing this work on apprenticeships and then talking about how to make it more attractive. People in environmental health have described it as a contact profession. So it's one that you get interested in because you come into contact with someone doing it. And a lot of people on environmental health courses had been working for a local authority or in the food sector first. So, how do we get school or college leavers to come straight into those courses and get to know about them? So I think there's a whole promotion issue that we can do along with the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health and the Chartered Institute for Training Standards.
Thank you, Emily. Going back to your trip to Brussels quickly, given the importance of international cooperation in managing food safety incidents, how does the FSA plan on maintaining sturdy information sharing relationships with the EU and indeed other countries, especially now in the current post-Brexit landscape of the UK?
Yeah, I mean, it is different to pre-Brexit because pre-Brexit we had member state access to the Rapid Alert System for Food and Feed, or RASFF as it's known, and we now have third country access to that. So we still do get alerts that are related to the UK come through to us, but we don't get to see alerts that relate to other countries in the way that we did before. And sometimes we don't get quite such real-time information either. So we knew that was going to be an issue before we left the EU. So we did quite a lot of work in the run-up to 2021, preparing a new signal monitoring system, which is a bit of quite clever and not too expensive IT that we have that just goes around the internet and collecting signals about possible risks to the UK food chain. So it has a natural language processing model in it, and it does sort of instant translation, and it brings back signals every week using AI technology to just scan these international open data sources. And that allows us to direct our food efforts. And it's been useful. For example, we were the first country to identify salmonella linked to Ferrero products, and there was a huge amount of food safety action taken as a result of that. So that's helping a lot. We're also just making sure that we have good informal connections with other countries. So I, for instance, did a joint trip to Rotterdam last autumn with the chief executives of the Irish Food Safety Authority, the Belgian, and the Dutch, and Food Standards Scotland, because we all felt that we were dealing with product that was going across Great Britain to Ireland, Northern Ireland, or to Netherlands and Belgium. We just thought it was quite important that we were We knew each other well, and we understood our systems well. And we thought we went to visit Rotterdam because we wanted to see exactly how imports were handled there, and that was a fantastic way of sharing information and making sure we had good relationships in place.
Emily, just how important are those good relationships with other regulatory bodies from different countries? Would you say that this guides the FSA's efforts, improving the way it works at the moment?
It can be really important. Like last year, for example, there was an Ireland recall that the Food Safety Authority in Ireland did. And we have really good relationships between my team in Northern Ireland and their team in Dublin. And then I also am in touch regularly with the chief executive. And so we have technical information flow, as within the law, so that we know what's going on. But it can also help to just have that strategic exchange of insight as well. So that does make a difference.
Emily, one last question from me for today's podcast, and it's to do with food safety incidents and how they can have serious consequences for both consumers and businesses. How does the FSA ensure that the UK businesses understand their responsibilities in this context? And can you share any mechanisms that are in place to ensure swift action when food safety risks are identified?
Yeah, I mean, all credit and compliments to the food industry here, because I think people do take food incidents very seriously, and we have very, very active cooperation between our incidents teams and them. So, I mean, the FSA has got incidents teams located in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and then Food Standards Scotland has its own incidents team, and we coordinate very closely with them. And they respond to food and feed incidents and foodborne outbreaks. We basically assure that any food or feed that's not compliant with food safety or other legislative requirements is removed from the market. And we also, along with the sort of direct contact that we have with individual businesses, they're often getting in touch and we're talking through issues. We also have a food industry liaison group. So that's got the main trade associations on. It meets every 4 to 6 weeks to exchange information on food safety matters and emerging risks. So there's that piece. And then on the fraud front, I have our National Food Crime Unit, which is there. It does a lot of investigations and prosecutions in relation to food fraud, but it also does a lot of prevention work. So they engage a lot with businesses to help them prevent the possibility of food fraud as well. And then we have our alerts service. So consumers can sign up for that and they get alerts when a recall or a withdrawal has happened.
Thank you, Emily. Food fraud is definitely something that I'm going to be racking your brains about in the next episode of Food to Go. But thank you so much for joining me today. It's been absolutely fantastic to speak to you and hear all of your insight.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Food to Go, and a huge thank you to our podcast sponsor, Merck, for making this episode happen. If you enjoyed, then please keep an eye out for our next one, where I continue the conversation with Emily to discuss important topics, including food fraud and allergy safety. That's all from me for now, but make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from to make sure you never miss an episode. Thanks for listening.